Welcome back. It's good to see you again, Pastor Paul. I'm Steve.Autrey, pastor at Denver United Methodist Church, here with my good friend Paul Thompson.
Yeah, don't lie to them.
What's that?
You're not happy to see me. You were making fun of me a minute ago, and how I wasn't very pretty.
I always make fun of you. How's that any different from any other day?
I know if our relationship is good, you're making fun of me, and I'm making fun of you. If we ever start being nice to each other, I'm going to get nervous. I'm not thinking that's going to be good.
We both grew up with only brothers, so I don't think we know how to be nice to each other.
Right.
Except but occasionally you let me borrow your truck.
I do. Yeah. And I'm going to make you start paying for that. I've decided you aren't paying enough for that. So expect more.
All right, send the bill.
Yeah.
I'll get right on it. So here we are in the Bible reading for the year, reading the Bible through. Bible year, if you want the book. Let me do that where you can actually see it.
Yeah.
But we always post the readings on the website. We also this week started putting a QR code in our bulletin. And
y'all are fancy.
We are on the screen at the 9 o'clock service, so to make it easy. But today, in particular, this week we are covering pretty much most of Exodus. We are covering from chapter 15 all the way through the end, which is from chapter 15 to chapter 40. Now, last week, just quick recap, we kind of took the story from the person of Joseph, Israel being enslaved over generations in Egypt, and then the call of Moses. And again, kind of the theme was, hey, here's a really big problem. The people are enslaved, and God's answer was a very small, a little bitty baby, right? We should take some hints from that. That's kind of how God addresses the biggest problems in the world. So then Moses, if you kept up with the reading, he finally answers God's call, some reluctance. Now that's the burning bush story. But then when Moses does go to Pharaoh, how's he received?
So this Exodus event is the identity story of Israel, and it is centered around one guy, which is fascinating to me. How so much of the stories of the Bible is God working through one individual. Begins with Abram, one person. Begins with Joseph, one person. Here's the story of God intervening in the course of human history, and he picks one guy, Moses. Fascinating that Moses reluctantly, with every excuse in the book, says, I can't do this, I don't know how to talk, all of that. And God says, you're going.
Well, and I want to push back on you just a second. All right. But be careful not to make the story of salvation hyper-individualistic.
No,
right?
No.
This is all to serve the larger community.
But it is the story. It begins with the story of how God works in the heart of one person for the good of the whole.
And at least in the amazing sermon I delivered on Sunday, talked about those images of the kingdom that Jesus always uses things that are small, like yeast and seed, a woman finding a coin, things that aren't armies and navies and geopolitics. It's the small things that bloom into something big. And we see in the birth of Moses, of course, small baby grows up to do miraculous things. So eventually, the people are let go, and there's a lot of drama in the story. There are 10 plagues in total. Eventually, the people come out of Israel, where and the last plague is the angel of death, right? So, which signifies to us the Passover. Like, so, God commands the people before they, the night that the angel of death is coming, to sacrifice the lamb. I think it also you could have used a goat.
Yeah.
Right? Anyway, so you put the blood on the doorpost and the top of the door frame, and the angel would pass over, hence the name Passover. And then they are commanded to tell this story from generation to generation. And here's how you remember the story.
So they remember it through the Passover Seder, the meal, and the elements of the meal, from the unleavened bread, the carosis, all of these things are meant to jog the memory. Hey, remember these were the items.
Right.
we can go ahead and foreshadow it was Jesus who the Gospels say was seated at a Passover Seder, who when he institutes the Last Supper, he takes that unleavened bread. This is my body broken for you. He takes the third of the fourth cup and says, this is the cup of thanksgiving. So just always reconnecting back this, even the New Testament story is grounded in our Old Testament, and you have to understand those connections.
Right, which is why we are asking you to read through the Bible. Because the New Testament stands on the Old Testament. They're interrelated. The better you know the Old Testament, the better you'll be able to understand the New Testament. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to, again, Pharaoh lets them go. We get that dramatic moment at the Red Sea. God parts the waters. They go through on dry land. The Egyptians pursue them. God drowns the Egyptians, and the people of Israel are free.
I think there are two critical things we have to remember about identity. For 420 years, the people had been enslaved in Egypt. 430, okay. 430. Fact check, 430. For a long time, they had lost probably most of the connection that the stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. 400 years in slavery, they had lost that sense of these were our ancestors. This is the God who was working.
Right.
So then that call to leave, that call to go to the place, those who responded to that call, they were being reformed, reshaped as a people. And then we're getting ready to talk about that next form of their identity is, and this is how we're going to live together.
But they weren't completely devoid of memory.
They would have had memory, but after 400 years.
Yeah, exactly. That's a long time.
It's a long time.
They do take the bones of Joseph with them, correct? Mm-hmm. And that's a signal of connectivity to the past, although they have not. Just think about what they had not done, and we don't know how many generations it was before they were actually enslaved, but they had not had any sense of governing themselves and not had any sense of providing for themselves.
I think we can look back through history at people who are oppressed, people who are enslaved. Part of the recovery, once they are released from that, is trying to figure out who we are in a new way, in a new land.
What story do you tell? What song do you sing?
Yeah.
So that's where we kind of find most of the scripture for today. They're out there, and how do you build a nation? So, but before we get there, I'm going to ask you a question. I know something about when I ask you questions. You talk just like a college football coach. I ask you a question, and you answer whatever you want. You're like in a press conference.
Yeah.
What was that dust up on the sideline? Well, we played really hard today, and I'd like to think. Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a question.
All right.
I want you to
answer.
Direct
question. All right. Direct question.
Why should I read all of Exodus? Because the good parts kind of end whenever they get across the Red Sea, and then I've got page after page of talking about laws, and then talking about building, how to construct the tabernacle. Why should I wade through all of that?
Simple answer. If you want to understand the New Testament, you have to understand where all of the symbols and imagery and all of these ideas come from. Everything from the law and this whole relationship to, is our relationship with God based on our capacity to follow the law? That's a fundamental question that arises from Exodus. Secondly, the idea of tabernacle is directly tied to the presence of God. The tabernacle represented that God has pitched his tent. God has dwelt with us. You go to the first chapter of the Gospel of John, and the Word became flesh and pitched his tent among us. Jesus is the tabernacle of God. In other words, the presence of God walking with us on the journey of life.
And so what I see, and what we're going to talk about Sunday at Denver, as they hear yet another incredible sermon, will be that, when you look at the law, and by the way, there'll be like 613 commands in here, right?
Mitzvah.
It's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the instructions of the tabernacle, right? Those should be held side by side, because the law also creates a way to dwell with God emotionally, spiritually, intellectually, where the tabernacle gives the opportunity to dwell with God in a physical space, that a reality. And then when you get to Jesus, guess who Jesus is? He's both.
He is both.
Right.
Yeah. So it is critical that even though so much of this Exodus material seems foreign, and we would look at it and go, what difference does that make to a modern day Christian? To recognize that it is the story of how God has unveiled all of this and how Jesus is the fulfillment. He is the perfect fulfillment of the law that God gives to Moses. He is the perfect fulfillment of the presence of God that is tabernacles, a tent living among us. That's those are really important concepts for us,
right? And so we see the people. We see that God's trying to shape them, form them. In a sense, I hope you can hear echoes of the creation story, because God starts with nothing and creates, right? So while God's not starting with nothing, He's starting with a people, but He's starting with a people who are very raw in their ability to govern themselves and to take care of themselves. They even complain against Moses not long, right, into the journey, because they get hungry. Who's going to feed us?
Yeah. So this whole story of Exodus is really about forming a people. They had a past, but after 400 years, the memory was not good on what does it mean to be God's people. So then they wander out into the desert. A journey that should have taken 2 weeks is now going to take 40 years. And in that journey, God says, and I'm going to have to teach you what it means to live in relationship with me as you live in relationship with one another. And that is the entirety of what the law is all about.
Right. Relationship with God, relationship with one another. This Sunday, we will be looking in particular at the 10 Commandments, which, the first 10, right? But the 10 Commandments represent the totality of the law in a sense.
They're often called the 10 words. So it's 10 words that shape and define how God wants to be revealed. The law reveals that this is the nature of who this God is. Again, how to live in relationship with this God by living in relationship with one another.
So as we're reading through this, some of it will, again, it's not easy reading.
No,
I do want to name that.
A little bit of that.
And what I found is, for me, especially through once I get past the Red Sea and Moses starts getting all these instructions and rules, it's easy to zone out. So for me, I think I found a good Bible book on tape, Bible read on tape or audiobook, and that helps me. So I would encourage you to do what works for you.
Yeah.
Again, it's not easy reading, but it's worthwhile reading. So please, take the time.
You'll find a lot of repetition
Right.
in the scriptures.
Yeah.
Said the same thing several different ways.
But it was important for them to write it down several different ways, so we should probably take a look at it. So one of the things I want to think about is, where is Israel formed? What is, and Scripture doesn't shy away from talking about wombs and being formed and being birthed. So think of these again, and they spend 40 years in the wilderness because really a lack of faith. They don't trust that God will give them the land that He has promised. They actually go in, look around, come back, and go, "Ooh, that's
a little scary."
A little scary. And that's when God's like, this generation, none of you, except for Joshua and Caleb, none of you are going to see the promised land.
Yeah, if a generation is rough and dirty, especially in that day, 20 years, it's almost 2 full generations that go from leaving Egypt to the actual arrival in
right.
the promised land.
Right, that's generally how we look at generations, about every 20 years. Biblically, 40 is usually, but either way, it's been a while, right? So, think about it, 400 years, 430 years in Egypt, another 40 years in the wilderness. But it's in that wilderness that they are formed as a people. It's a crucible that shapes them. And I wonder, Paul, you've you've had a lot of stuff going on in your life, and a lot of experience in ministry. What does it mean to be in the wilderness? And what does God do in wilderness places?
So the wilderness places are places of growth. Most of us understand that when we're comfortable, when life is good, we've got all the food, we've got all the money in the bank, we've got all the things. We
usually equate
ourselves.
that with security.
We usually relate that security, but we look at it, and those are times when we're relying on ourselves. You go out into the wilderness where there's a lack of provision, where there's a lack of much of anything, and we really find out that's where we grow. And I think most of us would recognize our faith grows not when things are going so smoothly. Our faith tends to grow in those moments in which we are challenged. We lose someone we love. Our boss walks in and says, "We don't need you anymore." The doctor looks at us and says, "Hey, don't like the looks of that."
Yeah.
Those are the times when it feels like we're in a wilderness. But so often that's where the real growth occurs, the real test of our faith, the real development of our faith.
Mm-hmm. That's the biblical pattern.
That's the biblical pattern.
And we do not grow well in ease, right? We usually revert, but in those wilderness places, there's was it St. John the Cross who used the term the dark night of the soul. Mm-hmm. I've heard this also referred to as the land in between. You've left, but you haven't arrived.
Right.
And that in-between period can be really hard. And in some ways, that reflects where the church is, right? So we have been formed and shaped and established by who Jesus is and the strength of the Holy Spirit, but we're on our way to the ultimate reality of the full reign of Christ throughout all of creation. We're not there yet, right?
So all of life can be seen as a wilderness journey, looking toward that home base, that promised land.
So how well would a faithful Jewish person know all of these rules?
So it would have been ingrained, just like we learned the ABCs at an early age. They're going to wake up every day and they're going to talk about these 613 rules, these 613 mitzvah is the word. They're gonna ponder them as they wake up. They're going to ponder them at mealtime. They're going to ponder them at night. You look throughout the Old Testament, through the Psalms, the law of the Lord, I reflect upon it. I wake up thinking about it. So these young Israelites would have been steeped in learning. This law would have been just for them as like an ABC 1, 2, 3.
Well, and I think we forget, because we read this from a modern context, we can't help but read it from the lens that we currently occupy. And we are used to the notion of having laws. Mm-hmm. We grow up in a culture that is very well regulated, and where lawlessness is not tolerated. Where there, so we grow up with this notion that there should be laws. That is such a foreign concept to the ancient world.
Yeah.
And to have a legal system in place that protects people's property, that protects people who are vulnerable, like widows and orphans, and even the immigrant and the sojourner. You talk about hugely countercultural, and also to insist, even to command that you don't work for a day. That's not that was like, what kind of God? Who are you people? So part of what God has called Israel to be is a distinctive people, right?
Set apart. A light to the Gentiles, a people who are different than the world, peculiar, because God's showing this is how I'm going to reveal through this distinct group of people. I'm going to teach the rest of the world through them.
And as a kid, I remember hearing a lot of, several sermons on this where the preacher would almost poke fun at some of the Old Testament laws, right? And then talk about how we don't have to, worry about these anymore because of who Jesus is. And that's true, right? But I also think we miss something if we just look at these rules and regulations, the law of God, especially some that seem so strange to us and just laugh them off. There's a reason God put those in place. And that reason was to form this people and to give them an identity.
So the law is about an identity. This is what's gonna shape our relationship. You and I might look at these and ponder why would God do a Sabbath day, for example,
Or why would God tell you not to eat shrimp?
Yeah, and the reality is God is setting boundaries for us in ways that we would normally do. We normally don't like to be have any boundaries. I will eat what I want to. I will do what I want to.
I mean, you were born down in the middle of Georgia. I think they sent you home with a Hormel bacon starter pack, didn't they?
Absolutely, man. You, as early as you think about drinking Mountain Dew at an early age,
right, and eating pork.
Yeah. So not the healthiest start.
But the idea here is to form a distinct community, and to give them a way to exist. Because I mean, as one thought I had, one thing we did in our staff meeting today as a devotion time, asked this question to our team: what would this community look like if everyone followed every one of these laws? What would it look like?
Yeah, so we would live in a utopian society if we all learned to even the basic 10, of which you can expand in the rest of the
right.
It would according to Jesus. The rest of it's just a commentary on the first 10.
Right, and so I mean, think about what it would mean. It would mean that there would be no more affairs. There would be no more jealousy. There would be no more killing. There would be no more of elder abuse. There'd be no more child abuse. You go through it and you're like, wait, if we really did live this way, we would have respect and dignity towards God and respect and dignity to everybody else.
So I think the Old Testament, the Ten Commandments, are neatly broken into two different groupings. The first three are how you to live in relationship with God. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not use my name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Those are how we live in relationship with God. And I think we start off there. But then very quickly, the last 7 are about how we live in relationship with one another. And I think if we can begin to see the law as summarizing, this is how you're supposed to order the way that you live.
Right. Yep.
To live in a relationship with God means we have to live in this kind of relationship with one another. The Apostle Paul, when we get to the New Testament, Galatians 5:14, Paul makes this profoundly just mind-boggling statement. He says the entirety of the law can be broken down into one simple statement, and that's to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, Paul, hey, time out here, man. Yeah. What about the love of God? And what Paul would then go on to say is to love your neighbor rightly, to love your neighbor and not have all of this envy and not all of this jealousy and rage of one another. That is the way to love God.
Which is why I want to come back around to, with that little bit of pushback I had, that we can't make this an individual journey. It's not just about us and Jesus. And if that's all it is, then we've missed Jesus. Mm-hmm. It's about us, Jesus, and everybody else. And understanding our common bonds of humanity. And to follow Jesus means to be unleashed into the world as a representative of Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because Jesus would say in the Gospel of Matthew, he said, I didn't come to abolish the law.
I came to fulfill it.
I came to fulfill it. I came to show you and help you understand this is what it looks like to be faithful in living out that law, and it is simply the law of love.
Right. So if you're looking for a little supplemental reading and you have a little bit of an irreverent streak, then I would recommend The Year of Living Biblically by A.J. Jacobs. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. It's the story of a writer who is Jewish but non-practicing. And so he's like, let me try to see if I can live by what the law of Moses is. And it's a fascinating journey that he goes on that actually leads him to connect with his Jewish faith. But it's also a little irreverent at times. Just a warning, trigger warning, whatever you need. But I read it several years ago. It's highly entertaining, but it also, you'll also learn a lot about some of the intricacies of the law of Moses and how those actually apply to the ancient world, and how a lot. There's so many of these. It's easy for us to read some of these. That doesn't mean anything to me anymore. Well, some of it does mean a lot to us.
Several years ago, Steve and I were talking earlier about our shared trip. We got to go with a group of pastors to Israel and visit the Wailing Wall, which is the kind of the remaining wall of what would have been the temple in its day.
And Solomon's temple.
And so we went, and to enter, you have to put on the yarmulke.
Mm-hmm.
And you walk in, and of course, most people now are putting little prayer concerns, little rolled up pieces of paper in the cracks in the walls, and that's one of the big things. But when you go by, you see that there are practicing Orthodox Jews today who have their tablet laid out in front of that Western Wailing Wall. What are they studying, and what are they doing?
Studying the Torah.
They're studying the Torah. They're studying these 613 mitzvah. They're studying this idea because in their mind, it is such of the same thing. A relationship with God is understanding these rules and understanding the reason behind these rules and it's an interpretation about what does it mean to remember the Sabbath day? Well, it means you can't take more than 30 steps. It means you can't turn on the oven, but you could take a bite of something that is already prepared. So,
but the point of that is every one of those actions should connect you with God.
It is about connecting with God. We have tended to make it, however, look what I've done.
Yeah.
Look how good I am.
And that was some of what Jesus encounters when he comes.
Mm-hmm.
And you brag about keeping the letter of the law, but you've forgotten the spirit. So it's very important that the spirit of the law is to create that space for us to be in relationship with this holy, amazing God. And also that when you read through those tabernacle instructions, the tabernacle was meant to reflect the glory of heaven. So it's bringing together on the earth all those things, heaven and earth, God and us. So as we wrap up, what do you have going on this week at Huntersville?
All right, so let me make one last connection as we kind of ease into that.
I told you as a football coach.
Yeah, football
won't
coach.
Answer my question.
So the people of Israel, they receive the law. They wander in the desert for the next umpteen years until finally they get the word. You're going to go in, and yet Moses is not allowed to enter.
No, nope.
Because Moses had killed a man. You remember the story where he kills the Egyptian slave master. He has blood on his hands. At one point, he takes the stick and hits the rock rather than touching the rock. It is a kind of a representation that Moses was not.
Well, I have to say it doesn't seem fair.
Yeah, it doesn't seem fair, but Moses he's allowed to look at the promised land without going
But
into
also,
the promised land.
I wonder about Moses. By this time, he's an old man.
He's old.
And he's got to be exhausted. And he's probably like, okay. Well, it also tells us, though, that the story passes from one generation to the next. It's not just one person's story. And the leadership will pass to Joshua. So,
and let's talk just one quick second about what does that name mean, Joshua?
It means Joshua. Something about
It's
God
from the
with
word-
us.
Yeah, it's we get this idea of Yeshua. Jesus is the same root word as Joshua. It simply means God saves.
Yeah.
And it is this realization that God is at work saving God's people through all of these acts. The giving of the law, the entering into the promised land, and the story is being written. It's going to get to Jesus, but all of this work has to be done prior to that. So to answer your question, this coming Sunday at Huntersville United Methodist Church, we have our typical 8:30 and 10:30 services. I hadn't been there the last two Sundays, so I'm kind of about forgotten my way to get there, but I'm hoping I'll be there Sunday. I hope the good folks. Again, we have communion at 8:30. Why do we have communion at 8:30? Because we have discovered that it is the best tangible way to live out the faith. The symbolism, the meaning behind taking a piece of bread and ingesting it, and the wine, the cup, the grape juice, to believe that this becomes for us a symbol of we are taking in the body of Christ, the blood of Christ. Powerful images that, again, are drawn from this Passover experience.
So at Denver, we will be having services at 9 and 11. Together with those who have been attending the 8 o'clock service, we had a kind of a family conversation about the 8 o'clock service, and we're going to suspend it for the time being. Our hope is that we will be able to grow our 11 o'clock service to the point where we need another service, but right now that's kind of where we are. So 9
Those
o'clock,
are hard decisions.
they are
aren't
hard, and it is painful. I know there's a lot of grief, especially there were about 32 people who were just there every Sunday. But we had to make some tough decisions about how to do this, and just I've asked them if they would to, sometimes God calls us to sacrifice, even our comfort or whatever, and our preferences. And I appreciate their reception and their generosity of spirit that we encountered on Sunday morning. But so 9 o'clock and 11. And for worship, in between is a Sunday school hour. And if you are watching this and you're like, hey, I may want to jump in on a class, come over and join the group that I help lead in our old fellowship hall that we call the Court, and we'd love to have you.
Well, folks, I know what a challenge it is to try and read these scriptures. A lot of it seems so foreign. A lot of it just seems, I don't even understand what I'm reading. But I hope you'll hang in there. I hope you're participating in a group. I hope you're watching this podcast,
right,
so that it gives you just a little bit of background. If you can start beginning to make some understanding of what the history is behind the scriptures, is going to make the journey so much better.
And to help with that, Wednesday nights we're starting back actually tomorrow night, which will be after this podcast comes out. But Wednesday nights we're starting back our table talk. We'll have a meal. If you would like to go deeper into this, there are a couple of options for younger families. Pastor Ben's leading a group. For whoever else wants to fall into a place, I'm leading a group. So hopefully you come, we'll go a little deeper and see where God leads us in all of this. But thank you for being here today. Thanks to our Pastor Ben, who's technical director on this, as Courtney's out on
We do miss Courtney,
leave.
and we trust that she and that new baby are just bonded and getting more in love every day.
Every day. So thank you, and God bless you all.